Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so today we're going to continue the theme of World War I, and we're going to be talking about the changes of warfare in World War I. As you remember, during our older wars, the older wars of the world, as well as the older wars in America, like the Civil War, this war was fought differently. Those wars were fought basically shoulder to shoulder, firing rounds of musket shot at each other. And because of the changes in warfare during World War I, we have a new type of fighting. So after Congress voted to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the American forces began to mobilize for an unprecedented attack on Europe. And finally, on June 26, 1917, the first 14,000 American troops arrived in France. And when the Americans arrived, the Allied forces were on the verge of losing the war because both fronts were suffering great amount of casualties. Russia had left the war. Austria-Hungary and Germany was able to put all their force onto the Western Front, and it was getting very close to a defeat. When the American soldiers arrived, they were given the nickname Doughboys, which is unflattering to say the least, but it was definitely well-deserved because on their arrival, most European soldiers were fighting and living in the trenches for over 3 years and eating small rations to keep them alive. And American soldiers go over there, they weren't necessarily chubby, but to all those starving European veterans, they were chubby. Their look was also not ignored by French women, believe it or not, because many Americans felt prey to the Paris nightlife, and the American men contracted diseases from French women and really cost the American government millions of dollars in medicine and anti-French propaganda. And the first U.S. troops to arrive there, they were called the American Expeditionary Force. And this American Expeditionary Force was led by General John J. Pershing. And these troops were well trained before they even reached the front lines. They were a mixed group of Army and National Guard troops, draftees, and inexperienced volunteers. And when they arrived in Europe, they weren't just thrust into the battlefields either with those European soldiers, but they joined as a separate force from the other Allied units. Pershing wanted to complete control over this unit. And as African American soldiers joined the wartime effort, they had mixed reactions to engagement. So you had different types of people going over to Europe in World War I at one time. You have this expeditionary force that Pershing wanted to have his thumb on the whole time, and then you had African American soldiers going over there as well, and they joined the wartime effort. And really, you know, you have to think about what time this is. It's the early 1900s. The French soldiers were treating them better than the American soldiers because of what was going on in America with Jim Crow segregation. Even Germany fed on African American racism in this effort because German propaganda was dropped from the sky over these black units, promising a less racist world if the Germans had won the war. So we also have a change in naval warfare. The war was not only fought on land, because as we discussed, there are many battles happening on under the sea. Much of the fighting took place in the Atlantic Ocean and in the North Sea. And we've discussed how the British blockaded German trade ports, which was trying to break the German supply lines, and Germany in turn responded by using this unrestricted submarine warfare, torpedoing American and French and British supply ships. And there were improved naval weapons on each side of the war. You have the British, and the most dangerous British warship of the time was called the Dreadnought. And many of these naval ships were small and carried only small caliber weapons, but the new Dreadnoughts were huge, metal-clad ships that would carry like powerful, long-range, heavy caliber artillery guns, which allowed them to hit enemy ships and enemy land targets from a huge distance away. And as we discussed before, that the introduction or the improved German U-boat, the Untersee boat, as previously discussed, these boats launched torpedoes from underwater and pretty much escaped undetected, sinking many Allied supply ships and passenger liners. And this German unrestricted submarine warfare was really a leading factor in the United States and their aggression against Germany. World War I also saw a different type of warfare than we were ever used to fighting before, and that's what I said. That's that shoulder to shoulder 60 years earlier during the Civil War, where they were shoulder to shoulder pointing guns at each other at point blank range. Even in the Spanish America war was pretty much over before it started. So that was just in the last 60 years, and what Americans witnessed in Europe was just new and surprising with this new type of warfare. And what it's called is trench warfare. So the Allied and the Central Powers would wind up digging long series of trenches where these soldiers would defend their position from the protection of deep ditches. That's what a trench is, this deep ditch. And these trenches were deep, cold, wet, muddy, and disgusting. When it rained, the trenches would gradually fill with water, and even though these soldiers placed things called duck boards on the bottom of the trench, it didn't stop the infestation of wet boots and trench foot. And trench foot was a health issue where the feet of the soldiers would stay wet and the flesh would literally just rot off the bone. These trenches were also filled with corpses, which is dead people, large rats, and feces, which is poop. And when these trenches would flood, so would the bathrooms. Sicknesses and disease ran rampant in the trenches. So how did the trenches work? Let's go right here. Here's how trench warfare worked. The Allied army would send thousands of shots to the Central Powers, and then lasting hours and days. And then when the Allied powers felt like they had inflicted enough damage, they would exit the trench and attack. And at that point in time, the Central Powers would then just annihilate that attack. And then in response, the Central Powers would launch thousands of shots pouring deadly bombs on the Allied army. And after hours of bombardment, guess what? The Central Powers would go out of their trench and attack, getting mowed down by Allied gunfire. And you just repeated this process over and over and over again. And this would go on for days or weeks until really a victor of the battlefield can be established. Sometimes millions of men were killed on the battlefield just to gain 100 or 200 yards. And you had this area between the trenches, and we call that no man's land, because if you were located in this part of the battlefield, you're most likely going to be killed. You don't want to be in no man's land. And it's this trench warfare that caused a big stalemate for many years between the two powers, where each side of the powers, the Central Powers and the Allied powers, had lost millions of men and gained very little ground. So you have to also remember that industry during wartime usually brings about new and improved weapons, and most of the time these weapons made land warfare more dangerous than before. And during World War I, there were many weapons that were improved and more deadly. The machine gun was improved by making it much lighter to carry and easier to move around. Flamethrowers were improved and were used heavily by the Germans on the Western Front to force the enemy out of their trenches. Artillery and hand grenades were improved as well and used to kill a lot of people at once. These long guns were improved as anti-aircraft weapons, shooting down enemy planes, with some guns even shooting up to 80 miles in a distance. Artillery guns and hand grenades inflicted the majority of the casualties in World War I, and barbed wire was used to protect trenches against enemy infiltration. And during World War I, there were also new and more deadly weapons introduced to warfare that was really used for the first time. tanks were introduced in World War I. These armored tanks would cross the land between the trenches or no man's land. They were usually outfitted with cannons and machine guns, and in the beginning they were really hard to steer and they would become stuck in the mud, but by the end of the war these tanks became more effective killing machines. Airplanes were also introduced during the wartime effort for the first time. Initially the planes were used for surveillance, flying over the trenches and cities of the enemy, gathering important information, but soon after that planes would be outfitted with machine guns and bombs, and they would battle each other in the sky with what you call dogfights. They would fly around attempting to shoot each other down, and later on airplanes would be used to fly over that no man's land and trenches, shooting the machine gun fire down into the trenches, dropping bombs into the trenches on the enemy, making these men easy targets for high casualties. And the final weapon that we're going to cover here was introduced during World War I, and this is the one that was introduced and produced the most casualties out of any new weapon that was made, and this was poison chemical gases. Germany would first use chlorine gas to poison unsuspected Allied troops in the trenches, and then later on even a more dangerous mustard gas was produced and used by the Central and Allied powers. These gases were by far the most deadly of the new weapons. They would suffocate you from the inside, destroying your lungs, sometimes filling them up with liquid and causing you to drown, and other times this gas would blister and melt your skin off. So by the end of the war, gas masks were issued to all the troops, and poison gas became less effective as a weapon towards the end of the war, but even gas masks were issued to animals. So these were the type of changes that happened during World War I.